This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Potential savings will vary. Not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, February 1913, Mexico City is in the midst of what would come to be known as La Decena Tragica, the 10 tragic days. The Mexican Revolution had been brewing in fits and starts for a few years at this point, with a lot of fracturing and infighting throughout the country, but this was the moment that it reached Mexico City, began to touch the highest offices in government, and really pulled the U.S. in. I gotta say, we haven't touched on the Mexican Revolution that much on this show and the U.S. role in it, in part because it is so fractured and complicated and goes on for so long. But this is a fascinating moment because of the U.S. meddling. We have Taft on his way out, Wilson on the way in. We have kind of a rogue U.S. ambassador trying to undermine the Mexican president. And of course, like with much of Latin America and the United States throughout the 20th century, we have business interests trying to pull some strings behind the scenes. And it wasn't that subtle, actually. So here we are about 100 years or so later from this moment. And look, we have another president talking about Mexico, throwing annexation ideas around. So maybe it's worth revisiting, if only to remind us that, yeah, the U.S. has always been up in Mexico's business. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Remember a couple episodes ago where I proclaimed that I was going to kind of catch us up on the state of the Vietnam War in like 90 seconds when we were talking about the USS Pueblo?
Mm-hmm.
I just like creating challenges for myself. So let me see if I can't roughly get us to the point of understanding the sort of fractured state of internal Mexican relations and the U.S.-Mexico relationship heading up to these 10 tragic days, as they're called. So we have Francisco Madero, who rises to power in 1911. He overthrows a dictator, and he is the Mexican president and largely a reformist, pro-democracy. He's known as the apostle of democracy. Kind of an interesting figure. He's like short and skinny and pale, vegetarian, doesn't drink, spiritualist. We've talked about spiritualism being a kind of big force in the first couple decades of the 20th century. He is, I think, a little more open to reform, but he's also balancing kind of radical reforms and, of course, the legacy of a dictatorship. The U.S., I think, as is often the case with sort of pro-democracy forces in Latin America, at first they're like, okay, we can see how this plays out. We'll be maybe okay with this. But then things start to get complicated from a U.S. perspective in particular. And I feel like you could just sort of copy and paste this sentence into most of stories like this. But guess what? Francisco Madero. The oil companies don't love him. He refuses to grant Standard Oil control over Mexican oil supply. He is in favor of labor strikes. And so what you end up having is basically business interests turning on Madero pretty quickly. And they find an ally in this guy, the U.S. ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson, who is the other big figure in this story. So should we call him HLW from now on? Or is that more confusing?
It's slightly harder to say.
That and it's Woodrow Wilson and then Henry Lane Wilson. And then
is about to arrive too.
I know. So we'll just call him Henry.
Henry. The ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson. He sees Madero as too weak and too kind of unwilling to toe the line in sort of U.S. business interests. I guess the other context here is that we do have William Taft, who's kind of on his way out, a sort of a lame duck here. Mm-hmm. And I think he basically just says, like, hey, Henry Wilson down in Mexico, do your thing. I don't really want to get too involved. This seems very complicated. So kind of like negotiate as you see fit, which kind of like lets the leash out on Henry Lane Wilson, I would say, the ambassador to Mexico, to really kind of stoke. And we'll see how that kind of comes to pass in a little bit. And then Woodrow Wilson comes into power, and he does not like Henry Lane Wilson at all. He calls him, quote, a guy who believes only a dictator can maintain order. So we have this sort of like tension between the incoming president and the ambassador to Mexico just at this moment that the revolution is breaking open and reaching Mexico City. All right, that was more than 90 seconds, but did I kind of pull it off?
I think we've got the sketch, right? We've got all the main players in place. We have revolution about to break out in Mexico at the very moment that the U.S. is in this transition between presidents. Taft is a little checked out. He's eyeing a Supreme Court seat, which he's going to be taking in a little bit. And Wilson doesn't have power yet. And in that bit of a power vacuum, Henry Lane Wilson comes in and is like, guess I get to freelance. Yeah. And that's happening just at the moment that the powder keg explodes in Mexico. You have a military revolt that breaks out, and the people who are leading it, one of them is the nephew of the former dictator, a guy named Felix Diaz. And then the other is Madero's general, Victoriano Huerta, who's secretly betrayed Madero. So Madero, as this fighting is breaking out, realizes he's in a really bad spot because he's not just facing a revolution. He's facing a revolution from someone who's tied to the former dictator, and he's lost his main general. So you have all this fighting that's breaking out in Mexico City, a place that had been pretty untouched by previous unrest. 5,500 people die in just 10 days. Many of them are civilians. And Madero is like, how do we get out of this? And he reaches out to Henry Lane Wilson because he knows that Henry Lane Wilson is stirring shit up. Reaches out to him, meets with him, and Wilson is like, no, I back the rebels. And I think in realizing that he has lost the United States and lost the army, Madero realizes that he is in a pretty bad position. And in fact, he is arrested. He's forced to resign. And then later on, he is killed instead of being allowed to go into exile. Now, while all that is happening with Madero, Henry Lane Wilson is calling together the heads of the rebellion, Diaz and Huerta, and says, hey, we are going to need somebody to run the country now that we're killing the old guy. So Huerta, why don't you take over?
And this is not so subtle. This is happening at the U.S. Embassy, right?
Yes. It's a formal conversation where they're like, let's install a military dictator. And that's what they do.
Yeah. This is wild behavior. I mean, part of me is like, poor Madero. He was just trying to lead his country. He was just trying to not eat meat and keep things stable and keep big corporations out. Like, I felt bad for him, especially when he's assassinated, I guess you could say. But after this, there's a lot of instability, I should say. There's instability for years, actually about 6 years. Mexico doesn't really have a leader. They are cycling through all of these different, generals or would-be dictators, and pretty much basically installs this other dictator that's kind of similar to Diaz, but he doesn't last long at all. He's got opposition coming up. And at this point, Wilson really needs to intervene because the instability is just not sustainable. And so he tries to basically invade Veracruz and says, okay, all right, we're going to bring in troops and we're going to try to secure control. And all of that backfires. Like, sending in troops does not work. It actually fuels anti-American sentiment, both in the United States and in Mexico. And at this point, Mexico is also reconfiguring its constitution. And in 1917, it basically says, all right, we're going to reestablish ourselves and we're going to include restrictions and we're not going to allow any foreign business ownership. This is huge because in Mexico saying we're not going to have any foreign business ownership, that says to all of U.S. oil, to all of U.S. mining companies, you're not going to have a foothold in Mexico anymore.
Hey, it's Jody with a word about a fellow Radiotopia show, The Recipe. So I don't know about you, but with inflation and grocery prices what they are, and the fact that it's pretty cold where I live, I am spending a lot more time in my kitchen cooking recipes for me and my family and friends. The good old-fashioned dinner party, by the way, it's coming back. Give it a shot. I think this is the year we're going to become the home cooks we were all meant to be. And one of our newer Radiotopia shows is here to help on our culinary journey. It is The Recipe with Kenji and Deb. Kenji and Deb, of course, are J. Kenji Lopez-Alt and Deb Perlman, two of the best home cooks alive. I'm sure you know Kenji's YouTube, his contributions to the New York Times recipes, Deb's iconic cooking blog, Smitten Kitchen. I actually just went to my saved recipes on the New York Times cooking app to see which of Kenji's recipes were on there, and there are a ton. I like to make his vegan chili, his Taiwanese beef noodle soup. He has a great salmon recipe, and most importantly, he's the one that really got me to learn how to scramble eggs to perfection. So, The Recipe. In each episode, Kenji and Deb talk about the essential ingredients and techniques of a beloved everyday dish, the little things that make a dish really sing. One of the things I really love about this is that they have different styles and they sometimes disagree. That makes for a great podcast, and it's kind of the beauty of cooking. You have to figure out what works for you. And The Recipe is there to help. So, go ahead and check it out from Radiotopia and PRX, The Recipe with Kenji and Deb. You can listen and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Happy cooking. A quick word about Up First from NPR. Breaking news, as you've probably noticed, is pretty broken. You're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it, and maybe you feel a little bit of, I'm over it, I'm over the news. Well, if this sounds like you, I recommend that you listen to the Up First podcast from NPR. You get everything you need to know in an easy 15-minute update. Look, if you listen to this show, it is very likely that you follow the news and you care about politics, just like me. But I think one of the best choices you can make is decide how to engage with the news. And Up First is a perfect way to distill down to just the information you need to help you understand the news without getting overwhelmed and feeling that sense of news paralysis. Up First is national and international. There's facts and information, but there's also personality and analysis. Start your day every day with Up First. Change the way that you consume the news. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. This episode is brought to you by Mint Mobile. Let's take a moment to talk about your wireless bill. Maybe you, like me, take a look at that bill every month and get a little shudder that goes down your spine, and you ask yourself, how can it cost so much to get wireless service? But guess what? It really doesn't have to be that way. You can say bye-bye to your overpriced wireless plan's jaw-dropping monthly bills and unexpected overages because Mint Mobile is here to rescue you with premium wireless plans that start at $15 a month. All of their plans come with high-speed data, unlimited talk and text delivered on the nation's largest 5G network. You can use your own phone, you can transfer over. I made the switch from one of the major carriers recently. It was incredibly seamless. And just like that, it was like, I really didn't have to be paying that much all these years. If you like your money, Mint Mobile is here for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/thisday. That's mintmobile.com/thisday. Upfront payments of $45 for 3-month 5GB plan required, equivalent to $15 a month. New customer offer for first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See Mint Mobile for details. So just to take a step back here, and I'm sure I'm missing a lot of dates, but like just the stuff we've named here. 1911, we have a sort of reform-minded president come in. 1913, violence reaches Mexico City. He's deposed. Then between 1913 and 1917, we have a succession of different people installed, taking power. We have a rewritten constitution, 1917. And then, by the way, somewhere in all of this, there's World War I as well. Everything, everywhere, all at once.
Yeah. And World War I really throws sort of a wrench in everything because Wilson is trying to navigate Europe. He's also trying to navigate Mexico. And I don't know if you remember, this is taking me back to like orals in graduate school, the Zimmerman telegram of 1917.
Which
we
haven't done an episode on, but we should. Absolutely, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's totally worthy. And I forgot about I was like, oh, yeah, I can't believe that happened. I forgot about that. The Zimmerman telegram is basically Germany starts to meddle in Mexican affairs as well. And Germany is like, hey, we've got this idea. Hey, Mexico, if you ally with us, if you partner with us, if you agree to fight against the United States and there's victory, then we will not just give you Mexico, but we'll give you back Texas, we'll give you Arizona and New Mexico in exchange for this partnership, which is wild to think of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico like not being a part of the United States.
Well, it's wild to think of the U.S. being a German.
Well, yeah, I know, and the whole 9 yards. But thankfully, this telegram is intercepted, and the United States gets, wind of it and pretty much puts a kibosh on it. But the idea that Mexico was thinking of partnering with Germany is something that Wilson is also trying to intervene on both fronts. Now, he's in between a rock and a hard place and trying to intercede with Mexico, but also trying to figure out how he's going to play World War I.
Yeah. And the context behind all of this is, as much as Wilson may have differed from Taft in how to approach Mexico and Latin America, they all shared this belief in the Monroe Doctrine that the Western Hemisphere was the United States' stomping grounds, and that the U.S. would, to a certain extent, dictate what Latin American countries could do, but other empires and other countries could not. And so the Zimmerman telegram in particular is a violation of this deeply held American belief that, hey, nobody meddles in Mexico but us.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So that, I think, is where this kind of gets to a bigger idea or lesson that I want to kind of end on. I've been thinking a lot about how, you have this Monroe Doctrine mindset. You have the idea of American imperialism. And I think we're seeing talk of that coming back, right? But then, as we see in this story, and I think we're seeing now, the manifestation of that is often so, I don't know how to put this, but janky and slapshod and 2-bit. And so you see that in this story here, not to downplay the meddling, but you see how rocky and unstrategic and sort of reactive it is. Oh, we're going to try this scheme where Germany's going to do this thing, or we're going to try to do this scheme where we're going to bring Standard Oil in. And it's just kind of all just sort of feels slapped together with. And what are we seeing now? Oh, let's rename the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
Let's buy Greenland. Yes, I know that taps into big, dangerous ideas that we need to be aware of, but the stuff feels so petty and small and improvised.
Yeah. And unnecessary. Unnecessary.
Yeah. Well, certainly that.
But there's not the work behind it, right? There's kind of the ideology is behind it, but nobody wants to do the work. And that's probably for the best for everyone. But you end up getting some symbolic changes, some economic warfare, but kind of this idea of trying to do empire on the cheap is why you end up getting this very kind of tin pot empire.
Right.
Yeah, which is why by 1917, Wilson just pulls all troops out of Mexico, and he's like, all right, pack it up. We've got bigger fish to fry with Europe right now, and Mexico will come back to you, pretty much.
Right. And that's the other lesson here is that all these little schemes just distract you, right? And so you end up getting into a moment here where it's the U.S. has a world war on its hand, and all this stuff is just taking its eye off the ball. And I don't know. It doesn't feel strategic.
Yeah. Can I just also remind listeners, too, that the United States is also in Haiti at this point, too, and it's occupied Haiti during the same time that it's doing Mexico and facing Europe. It's just wow.
Well, I mean, part of this is certainly, I'm sort of formulating this thought in real time, but part of this, because so much of this is motivated by business interests and capitalistic interests, that I just often feel the deference to making a quick buck will always be there. So it's you can have a larger strategy and a larger doctrine, but then when a scheme to make a quick buck appears in front of you, that's what companies and governments that are beholden to companies are most sort of activated to do. And so that's where you end up with just harebrained schemes, because someone probably made some real money off a lot of this stuff. But it was in 6-month cycles, year-long cycles. It wasn't this kind of big philosophical doctrinaire thing.
Yeah, it's really, it has absolutely nothing to do with democracy and everything to do with big business and oil and mining and labor and cheap labor at that. And that's scams. Always what it comes down to. Yeah, that's always what it comes down to. The almighty dollar.
Well, look, I mean, I think it is also worth underscoring that during this entire period, Woodrow Wilson is talking about democracy and national self-determination, which were ideas that were probably recognized more in breach than in actuality, at least in the Western Hemisphere.
You got a school named after him.
Well, eventually. Yes. Maybe unnamed after him at some point.
I know.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Very thorny, of course, which is the point. But I'm glad we got to it. And that brings us to the end of the episode. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.